Hello, Antiochian men. This is Michael Bachlig once again with another interview in our interview series. And this time, I have a very special guest for this interview. I have one of the guest speakers for the upcoming second annual DOMSE Fall Retreat, Deacon Michael Hyatt, with us today. And I've been very excited about this interview. And thank you very much, Deacon Michael, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you having me on.
I wanted to start by just finding out a little bit more about yourself. If you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about your family, where you're from, and what you do for a living.
Yeah, so I've been married to my wife, Gail, for 41 years. I've got 5 daughters, 9 grandchildren, and I've spent most of my career in the book publishing world. I was most recently the CEO of Thomas Nelson Publishers. And when we sold the company in 2011 to HarperCollins, I made an exit to start my own business and become a full-time speaker and writer. So I've written two New York Times best-selling books. I've written a number of Wall Street Journal #1 bestsellers. And I've got a business now that's a leadership training company. So we have about 40 employees. We're in major corporations and we work with business owners and just help them to get what we call the double win, which is to scale their businesses, but to do it in a sustainable way so that they can have great health, they can have a great family, and be able to sustain their success over a long period of time.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you're speaking to something that resonates with me. I'm working in corporate America and know that it's a very important thing to stay balanced, and to really,
It
the
is.
best leaders are the ones that are able to strike the proper balance. So that's very important work that you're doing. And I know it's very
Thank you.
helpful. I'm sure, very helpful to the people that you're interacting with on a daily basis. I wanted to talk about your experience in the Orthodox Church and the fact that you are a deacon at St. Ignatius in Franklin, where the retreat is happening here very shortly. It's coming up pretty quickly. I was just curious on your perspective, your journey to Orthodoxy, maybe in a nutshell, how you found Orthodoxy and what that journey was like.
Yeah, well, I became a Christian when I was 18 years old. And I didn't grow up in a particularly strong Christian home. We were sort of nominally Methodist. And 10 years later, when I moved to Nashville, when I was 28 years old, I was introduced to Orthodoxy for the first time, and mostly through the ministry of Father Peter Gilquist, who at the time we were working together at Thomas Nelson Publishers, and also Father Gordon Walker, who was the priest at what became St. Ignatius Orthodox Church. And at that time, it was part of the Evangelical Orthodox Church. So I was introduced to Orthodoxy. I didn't have any background. I had no bias against it because I didn't even really have a category for it. And so I was absolutely intrigued by it and captivated by it. It was a little bit challenging, to be honest, to convert because there were some things in my evangelical background that created some obstacles for me. But over a 2-year period, my wife and I both converted. And I was ordained in 1987 when the Evangelical Orthodox Church was received by His Eminence Metropolitan Philip of thrice blessed memory. And he received us into the church. So I've been ordained as a deacon now since 1987. So what, now almost 34 years? And
Wow.
I've been assigned to St. Ignatius and served in that parish for that entire time. In fact, we now have 6 deacons, believe it or not.
Hmm.
And 4 of us have served together for almost 34 years. 2 of the priests have served together as well. So we've been all around the same altar serving together during that time. So it really, I think we've done our best to live out sort of the theme of what this retreat's going to be about, which is about unity.
Yes, absolutely. You have quite the impressive resume, Deacon Michael, and I wanted to talk a little bit about your experience with Ancient Faith Radio. I know
Mm.
that you had been chairman of the board for Ancient Faith until very recently, and also have a podcast called At the Intersection of East and West, and that's a podcast that I've had the pleasure of listening to even very recently. And I was hoping you would talk about your experience with Ancient Faith Ministries, and then also the goal of that podcast. I found the description itself very interesting. And if you allow me to, I wanted to read the description here
Okay.
in this interview. It says, all across the globe, men and women are finding themselves at a crossroads of faith, rooted in a desire to embrace the version of Christianity handed down by the apostles. They have come face to face with Orthodoxy. Deacon Michael understands that crossroads and is here to help. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that podcast, its goals, and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, so I was the chairman of Ancient Faith for 20 years until about a month ago. And I felt like at that time it was important to make a transition to somebody else, because I'm also the executive chair of St. Vladimir Seminary. So I just felt like I couldn't do both. And I love Ancient Faith. I love the vision and the ministry. And I've been involved in podcasting there for a number of years, I think almost maybe a decade now. But really what I've been trying to do on the podcast is I kind of consider myself bilingual. I spent most of my professional life in the evangelical world as the CEO of the largest Bible publisher in the world, which was Thomas Nelson. And so I understand the evangelical world. I understand what the questions are, what the concerns are, what the strengths are of that movement, and frankly, what the weaknesses are. And I feel like orthodoxy is the answer. And so, because I understand the Orthodox faith and I live in that world, and I've been an Orthodox Christian now for more than 3 decades and a deacon for a little more than 3 decades, I feel like I can speak that language too. So my goal has been in the podcast to try to make the faith simple and accessible to evangelical Christians. But also I've found that we've developed a pretty large audience of Orthodox Christians who are just trying to understand their faith and be able to explain it to their evangelical friends. So that's kind of the goal and what I've tried to do.
Yes, and I would say you've been very successful. And speaking as someone who's been Orthodox his whole life, I can tell you that it definitely has touched me and has taught me a lot. There was a specific, absolutely. There was a series that you did recently that was centered on the book Sacred Marriage. And that podcast series was one of the best I have ever heard.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage anyone that's watching this video to take a listen to that, especially if they're married or thinking about becoming married. Deacon Michael, I'll just tell you that it completely changed my perspective on the sacrament of marriage. And
wow.
what you did is you really gave the perfect Orthodox commentary to that book, who I believe was written by someone who isn't even an Orthodox Christian. But
that's right.
Reading that book, I myself I thought he had to have been Orthodox the way he was talking about marriage. And that podcast was presented in such an accessible way, like you said. It was in a adult Sunday school environment. There were people that you were interacting with, and you had your wife with you, which I thought was such a critical perspective to have. It wasn't just you speaking about marriage. You had your wife with you, and she was giving her point of view to really fill in the gaps. And it was a perfect icon of what you were talking about marriage being a dance where each of you have your roles, and you're doing that dance in the podcast in a way that I had never heard before. I was hoping you would talk about the experience of doing that podcast series, and it's a perfect segue to, I think, what you'll be talking about at the retreat, which is marriage.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a risk because we'd never taught anything, and we hadn't taught anything publicly, and nor had we recorded a podcast, so it was a little bit of a risk. But we've been married for 41 years. Gail is my best friend. She's my confidant. She's the first person I want to talk to when I wake up in the morning, the last person I want to talk to when I go to bed at night. And so, we've just got a great relationship. And I knew that it would come out. She didn't always agree with me, and that's fine. And I told her, I said, honey, I want you to have complete freedom to disagree with me, to challenge me, to push back. I want this to be a dialogue. And I think, frankly, the more of that there is, the more interesting it will be to the people that are listening. And I think it really brought out a point for us, and something I teach to business leaders, is that alignment and agreement are 2 different things. So you don't always have to be in agreement to be aligned. So there are times, as we've raised our daughters, as we've gone through this journey of life, that we always haven't agreed on something, but because we're committed to our marriage and because we're committed to each other as people, we've said, I don't fully agree with the direction you're going there, but I'm totally aligned with you. We are one. My heart is with you. So, I don't make a mountain out of a molehill, and she doesn't make a mountain out of a molehill. And we're able to move past those things and move as one. And it's really important when you're raising your kids too. because they sense whether or not mom and dad are one. And I think it's
Mm.
true. What's true in marriage has to be in the true in the church as well. We have lots of disagreements, in the church, and, disagreements on all kinds of things, sometimes petty things, sometimes bigger things. And I'm not talking about issues of doctrine or major issues like that, but on, just the logistical issues that are around running a parish. There could be disagreement, but we have to be aligned. God has created us to speak the same things as St. Paul says, and have the same judgment and be of one mind. And I think that could be true in our marriages as well.
Definitely. That's very, very good wisdom, and it's so well said. And I mentioned that this would be something that I'm assuming you're going to be kind of expanding on here at the upcoming retreat. There's going to be quite a few married couples I anticipate that will be at this retreat that will be eager to hear the wisdom that you have to share.
Mm.
And my wife has already commented on how much she's looking forward to coming to this
Oh, great.
retreat. She and I both read through the Sacred Marriage book together and enjoyed listening to the podcast together. It helped us tremendously. Would you be willing to give us a little tease about what you
Yes.
plan to talk about, even if you haven't gotten it all worked out 100% yet?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about it. In fact, a little bit every day. But the talk is going to be called "And the Two Shall Become One: Practical Strategies for Unity and Intimacy in Marriage." The thing is that all of us start our marriage in the sacrament, realizing that the sacramental action of God himself takes the two and makes us one. We become one flesh in Christ. But the problem is that if we're not careful, we drift apart. And, nobody wakes up the day after they get married and have received that sacrament and says, you know what? I think over the next 30 years, we're going to drift apart, maybe risk divorce, maybe not even get along or even speak to each other. That just kind of happens, not by design, but by drift. And I think the thing that God calls us to is to design not only our marriages, but our lives and our parish and all the rest to be more intentional, just like he is as the great designer. So I think it begins, and this is one of the things I'm going to talk about, is what is it that we want in our marriage? Kind of suspend disbelief, forget about its current condition, but to ask ourselves the question, what would we really desire if we could have God perform a miracle? What do we want for our marriage? And I'm going to talk about the fact that 3 times in the Gospels, Jesus says to people, what do you want me to do? Now, it's fascinating that he does that because he's God. He knows what they need, right? But he asked them, what do you want me to do? And apparently, it's important for them to get clear on what they want from God. And so I want to ask people that are in the audience, what do you want for your marriage? And to act like it could actually happen. I mean, our God is a God of miracles. He can do amazing things. I've seen so many marriages restored, even through that podcast. So many people wrote to me to tell me that their marriage was restored. They've taken their marriage to a next level. And I just want to see us live out in our married lives what God has worked in through the sacrament. So to get a vision for what our marriage could become, and to literally think, to step into the future a little bit and say, to describe what my marriage might be. And I do this every year. I do it through a planning exercise that I call a life plan. But to say, what do I want my marriage to be in 20 years? It's not going to happen by accident. Nobody drifted to a destination they would have chosen. It takes intention and it takes little action. So that's number one, is to get clear on the vision of what you want in your marriage. Number two, to be honest about where you're at. All progress begins when we acknowledge the truth. And so sometimes we kind of kid ourselves, or maybe we make believe, that our marriage is better than it is. But sometimes we just got to be honest and say, my marriage is not where I'd like it to be. And this is not to shame anybody. No, there's not going to be any shaming in this talk. But I think for most of us, we'd admit that our marriage has not reached its full potential, that there's more, even in the best of marriages, even my marriage with my wife, Gail, there's more, that we can achieve in terms of intimacy, in terms of unity in our marriage. But it starts by admitting where we are. And then talking about building a plan of getting where you are to where you want to be. And this is really practical strategies. And I'm going to be sharing some super practical practices or strategies that we can use to begin to make small investments in our marriage that will deliver like compound interest. That if we do these things over time, it can change the trajectory of our marriage and change the trajectory of our families.
I'm really excited about what you have to say at the retreat. And I really want to stress the fact that what you talked about in the podcast really opened my eyes. And I think, and I would like your comments on this, I think what you brought up early on in that podcast series about sacred marriage it really was talking about the fact that marriages are falling apart, and it's a symptom of a bigger problem.
Yes.
When in American culture, we're often conditioned to pursue happiness. And this is a point you brought up early on in that podcast series. And it honestly helped me connect the dots to a lot of other areas of my life and just in, my history, what I've gone through in my life, where I think all around us, we're taught, the pursuit of happiness is something that we have the right to do.
Right.
But the point that you make in that podcast that I thought was such a good one is that it's about holiness. It's not
Yes.
about happiness. And I was wondering if you would comment on how the talk about marriage is really just one part of the problem that we are currently facing in, especially this country, where we're taught to pursue happiness and not holiness.
Yeah. The problem is that our culture has become so me focused. And when you have a culture like that, then everything else exists for or as a means to bring about my happiness. So whether it's money or food or other people or my spouse, they have utility or usefulness so long as they bring me happiness. And if they don't bring me happiness, then their utility is expired. I no longer need them. And that's why divorce is rampant. And so there's this continuous quest to try to find somebody who will complete me. And the truth is, marriage often doesn't complete us, it depletes us. And there's difficult times in marriage that we have to struggle through. But if I can begin to see that I'm actually in this marriage, God has put me in this marriage with this woman to whom I'm married, to serve her and to be an instrument of helping her achieve holiness, and as we would say in Orthodoxy, to achieve salvation, then all of a sudden it completely reframes the relationship. I'm not there to have my needs met. I'm there to serve my wife, Gail, and help her meet her needs. And when she's there and things that she does that irritate me, those are like iron sharpening iron. Those are things for me to be able to work out my salvation. That's what God's ultimately concerned about, is that we experience theosis. We become more like Jesus Christ himself. And that only happens sort of in the furnace of adversity and challenges. So what that does is it gives meaning to our suffering, gives meaning to even our conflict, that God can use even that when we offer it up to him and say, oh, this is the way that he's affecting this sacrament of marriage so that the two become one. It's a process. It happens over time, and it's not always easy, but it's critically important. So we've got to have a little bit of a Copernican revolution where we stop seeing ourselves as the center of the universe and start seeing, first of all, Jesus Christ as the center of the universe. And to the extent that we grow toward him, we grow toward one another, and we achieve that unity that he intends in the sacrament of marriage. That makes sense?
It does. No, that makes perfect sense. And you said it again so eloquently. I think that there's something you said in your response that stands out. Marriage essentially was designed by God for us to become more like him, to become more like Christ. We do that by serving each other. And that's just a key point. Another one of those that was very helpful. And in the Antiochian men, our primary goal is to help each other to become more like God. And that is the goal of every Orthodox Christian, to have that actual deification process of becoming more like God. It sometimes can sound like such a unattainable goal, but it really is attainable.
It is.
And we reach that through the pursuit of holiness. And that's something that Father Hans and I will be talking about at the retreat as well. So yeah, what you have been talking about helped me personally, to connect a lot of these dots and to realize that, first of all, we're all connected. We're all in this together, and we all need to help each other. And who better to start with than our spouse if we're married? And, the way that you described it in the podcast and the way it's described in the book, that, we need to look at our spouse as being, one of God's daughters, and thinking of God as our father-in-law. And in that case, I think there's something the author said that really stuck with me. It was, there's no other way to get in my good graces than to be kind to my children. And
Yes.
thinking of it from that point of view, where if I'm thinking of God as my father-in-law, and if I'm mistreating my spouse, I'm dishonoring God. And that's the kind of perspective that really helped when you described it in that way. And reading the book, because it really was something that came out of the book, but the Orthodox perspective really does definitely help. And staying on the topic of the Antiochian men, because you have a very successful company that deals with leadership. Leadership is something that I think you would agree the men in our church need to be good leaders.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask for your advice. What does leadership look like? What does it look like from the perspective of an Orthodox Christian? And how would you give advice to men about being the right kind of leaders in the church?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought a lot about it. And I talk a lot about it on my business podcast called Lead to Win. In fact, the first couple of episodes, we talk specifically about what I'm about to share. And that's the concept of self-leadership. You can't lead others until you can lead yourself. And I find that I'm the most difficult person to lead.
Hmm.
If I can get myself to do what I know I need to do, that's a major accomplishment. And everything in leadership flows out of self-leadership. We can never get anybody else to do something that we're unwilling to do ourselves. If we wish that our families prayed more, or attended church more regularly, or had more piety, or more, passion for evangelism, or were kinder to one another, the first place to look if those things aren't happening is our own selves, to look in the mirror. Am I leading my home by being an example? Because here's the thing about leadership. You will replicate yourself. My dad was really injured in the Korean War, and he received a head injury that gave him a lifelong limp. And so my dad has always limped for as long as I've known him, and he's wheelchair bound now, but he limped severely. And I remember about 5 years old, when I was 5 years old, my mom came to me and she said, "Michael, you don't have to limp." And I had just unconsciously looking at my dad thinking, what does it mean to be a man? Oh, well, my dad walks like this. I need to walk like that. And so I was unconsciously limping. And my mom said, "You don't need to limp like dad does. Look at all these other men. Dad got hurt in the war, and that's why he limps." And that was a new revelation to me. Well, that's the principle or the law of replication, and it happens in leadership. The people that are closest to us will become like us. The good news is that our good traits, they will pick up. That's why parenting is more something that's caught, not taught. But the bad news is they also pick up our bad traits. So the first person we need to work on, the first person that needs to be a follower, is ourselves. So I would say that's where it really starts. So, for me, it's really simple. Am I doing my prayers daily? Am I reading the scriptures daily? Am I attending church? Am I participating in the sacraments? Am I doing all the things that God calls me to do so I can be an example to my family?
That's a great response. And Deacon Michael, I can't wait to hear more from you here at the retreat that's coming up in Franklin, Tennessee. I'm excited to be at St. Ignatius Church and to participate in the events at the retreat. And on behalf of all the Antiochian men, I want to thank you for your time today. I really appreciate, yes, you coming and just speaking to us, taking time out of your busy schedule. Your words of wisdom, I know, will be helpful to everyone watching this video. They've been helpful to me. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person, Deacon Michael, this coming early September here. It's going to be here before we all know it.
I know, just a couple of weeks away. I can't wait either. And I can't wait to meet you and meet all the men.
Definitely. Well, to all Antiochian men, remember that fall retreat is very, very quickly approaching us, and it's not too late. You can still register for that retreat and hear some great guest speakers, including Deacon Michael Hyatt. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you there. We'll have more interviews in our interview series here on our YouTube channel, so please stay tuned. And also remember to click on subscribe and on the little bell icon at the top. And also like this video if you like what you're seeing. And we're looking forward to having many more of these videos to share with you on our YouTube channel here in the coming weeks and months, God willing. And again, thank you, Deacon Michael, for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.